Rome, the capital of the world, the empire of laws, legions, and marble triumphs. But for Augustus, the first emperor, it was more than an empire. It was a project of morality, a mission to reshape Roman society from the inside out. He was not only the builder of monuments and conqueror of lands, but the self-styled guardian of virtue. And to him, the greatest enemy of Rome was not always a barbarian beyond the frontier. It was the creeping rot of decadence within. Augustus passed strict laws against adultery, criminalizing extramarital sex for both men and women. He forced senators to marry and have children, punishing bachelors. He positioned himself as the father of a new Rome, sober, disciplined, moral. But what if I told you that his very own daughter, his only child, mocked those laws in the most public, scandalous, and humiliating way imaginable? That Julia, Rome's first imperial princess, turned her father's vision into a cruel joke. That while Augustus paraded himself as the champion of virtue, his daughter was rumored to be the most notorious woman in the empire? Yes, this is the story of Julia, the princess who was supposed to embody her father's reforms, but instead became the embodiment of Rome's sins, the daughter of the lawmaker, who broke every law he made. Before we dive into Julia's life, we must understand her father. Augustus was obsessed with image. His reign was built on the promise that he had restored dignity to Rome after decades of civil war. He shut down the decadence of the late Republic, banquets of excess, the corrupt aristocracy, the power-hungry generals who turned the city into a battlefield. To the Roman people, Augustus was not just an emperor. He was a moral reformer. He stood for family values, for order, for discipline. He forced senators to marry. He taxed bachelors. He promoted laws that punished adultery with exile. Even his close friend Ovid, the poet, would be banished from Rome. His crime, writing verses about love and seduction that clashed with Augustus' ideals. Now imagine the weight of hypocrisy when the very princess of Rome, the woman meant to be a model for all Roman wives, lived a life of scandal that made Ovid's poetry look tame. Julia was born in 39 BC, the daughter of Augustus and his second wife, Scribonia. She entered the world at a time when Augustus, still called Octavian, was locked in the deadly struggle with Mark Antony for control of Rome. From the moment of her birth, Julia was not seen as a child but as a tool. In Rome, noblewomen were political pawns, their marriages arranged not for love, but for alliances. And for Augustus, Julia would be the most valuable pawn of all. He divorced Scribonia the very day Julia was born, claiming her mother had a sharp tongue. But in truth, he had already set his sights on another wife, Livia, the woman who would stand by his side as he built his empire. Julia grew up not under her mother's care, but under Livia's shadow. This was no ordinary upbringing. Julia's childhood was carefully controlled. She was educated, yes, but her education was designed to make her the perfect Roman matron, modest, chaste, obedient. Augustus even limited her public appearances, trying to ensure she appeared as the ideal daughter of Rome's first citizen. Her role was clear. She would marry whom her father told her, bear children, and embody the virtues her father preached to the empire. But Augustus could not control her spirit. Behind the veil of discipline, Julia grew into a woman with wit, charm, and a hunger for freedom. A woman who saw the cage her father had built for her and dreamed of breaking it. Julia's life was a series of marriages, each one arranged for Augustus's political advantage. Her first husband was Marcellus, her cousin, chosen to secure Augustus's bloodline. But Marcellus died young, leaving Julia a widow in her teens. Her second husband was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, Augustus's most trusted general and right-hand man. Agrippa was decades older than Julia, but their marriage was politically vital, producing 5 children, 2 of whom Augustus hoped would inherit his throne. After Agrippa's death, Julia was married off again, this time to Tiberius, Augustus's stepson. It was a loveless union. Tiberius resented Julia, resented being forced away from the woman he loved, and resented Augustus for using him as another pawn in his dynastic game. The marriage was cold, bitter, and filled with silent hostility. Through all of this, Julia became more than a pawn. She became a prisoner, a woman used again and again as a tool for her father's ambitions. And so, while Augustus sought to control her public image, Julia began to carve out her private rebellion. What happens when you cage a spirit too tightly? It rebels. Julia, the imperial princess, began to push against the boundaries her father set. At first, it may have been discreet, flirtations, whispers of affairs. But soon her defiance grew bold. Ancient sources claim that Julia turned the Roman Forum itself, the beating heart of the empire, into the stage for her desires, that she held drunken orgies beneath the very monuments her father built to celebrate virtue, that noblemen, senators, even married men were drawn into her circle of pleasure. To the Roman people, this was not just scandal, it was sacrilege. Now, how much of this is true? That is the great question. Ancient historians loved to exaggerate, especially when it came to women in power. But what is undeniable is that Julia's affairs became public knowledge. And for Augustus, the man who criminalized adultery, it was the ultimate humiliation. Augustus had sought to build a Rome of moral purity. He punished others for their sins, exiled poets for their verses, destroyed reputations for whispers of scandal. And yet, his own daughter, his blood, his legacy, became the living proof that his moral laws could not control even his own household. The irony was unbearable. Rome whispered about it in taverns, in the Senate, in the streets. How could Augustus demand chastity from the Roman people when his own daughter mocked him with excess? Julia became not just a scandal, she became a symbol, a reminder that even emperors cannot control desire. And so we begin the tale of Julia, the princess of Rome, the woman who mocked morality, the daughter who humiliated her father in the most public way possible. This is not just the story of forbidden love affairs. It is the story of a woman trapped in the golden cage of empire, who chose rebellion over obedience, pleasure over duty, and scandal over silence. In the chapters to come, we will walk through her life in detail, from the carefully arranged marriages that chained her, to the lovers who risked everything to be with her. From the wild nights in the Forum to the cold exile where she died in silence. From the hypocrisy of Augustus' laws to the legacy of scandal that shaped Rome's imperial dynasty. So I ask you, was Julia a reckless sinner who spat on her father's laws? Or was she a prisoner, rebelling in the only way she could? The truth, as always in Rome, lies somewhere between history and rumor. But one thing is certain, Julia's name still echoes, not as a paragon of virtue, but as the princess who turned morality into mockery. Julia was born into a world already reshaped by her father's ambition. Rome in 39 BC was no longer the free republic it claimed to be. It was Augustus' playground, and Julia, his only child, would become both his pride and his weapon. From the moment she drew breath, she ceased to be simply a daughter. She was dynastic currency, a golden pawn in the most ruthless game on earth, the game of Roman power. Julia's mother, Scribonia, was pushed aside almost as soon as Julia was born. Augustus divorced her on the very day of Julia's birth, coldly explaining that Scribonia was too argumentative. In truth, Augustus had already set his sights on another woman, Livia Drusilla, who would become his lifelong partner and Julia's stepmother. Thus, Julia's earliest years were shaped not by a mother's tenderness, but by the iron discipline of her father and the sharp, calculating presence of Livia. Livia was elegant, intelligent, and ambitious. To the public, she played the part of the perfect Roman matron, chaste, modest, and devoted to her husband. Behind closed doors, she was a strategist, weaving alliances, eliminating rivals, and preparing her own sons for power. To Julia, Livia was less a stepmother than a jailer. Her childhood was marked by restrictions, her every move carefully monitored. Julia was not raised for happiness. She was raised for duty. Unlike many Roman girls, Julia received an excellent education. She studied literature, philosophy, history, and rhetoric, often taught by the same tutors who trained Rome's elite young men. Augustus intended her to embody Roman virtue, to serve as a living example of the purity and discipline he demanded from all Roman women. She was taught modesty, obedience, and self-control. But beneath this strict education, Julia developed a wit that sparkled in conversation. Later anecdotes would recall her as sharp-tongued, quick with humor, and capable of disarming even Rome's sternest senators with a single remark. She became, in many ways, the perfect socialite, elegant, intelligent, and dangerously charming. Augustus wanted her to be a symbol. He succeeded, but not in the way he intended. As Julia grew into womanhood, her father began to deploy her in the only way Roman women of her status could be used: through marriage. Her first husband was Marcellus, Augustus's nephew. The match was strategic. By binding Julia to Marcellus, Augustus aimed to secure the succession within his own bloodline. Julia was barely a teenager when the marriage was arranged. She had no choice in the matter. Marcellus was young, handsome, and favored by Augustus, but he died suddenly at the age of 20, leaving Julia a widow before she had even begun to live. She was remarried quickly, this time to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, Augustus's most trusted general and political ally. Agrippa was no youthful lover. He was nearly 30 years Julia's senior, rough, practical, and battle-hardened. To Augustus, the marriage was perfect. It bound Agrippa's loyalty to the imperial family, while securing heirs of the bloodline. To Julia, it was another prison. But this prison produced children. 5 of them, 2 sons, Gaius and Lucius, who Augustus groomed as his heirs, and 3 daughters, who would themselves be used in dynastic marriages. For nearly a decade, Julia played her role. She was the dutiful wife, the mother of Augustus's future dynasty. In public, she was presented as a model of Roman virtue. In private, the seeds of rebellion began to grow. In 12 BC, Agrippa died suddenly. Julia, still in her 20s, was once again a widow. This time her father's ambitions grew even sharper. He needed to ensure the Julio-Claudian bloodline remained strong. And so Julia was forced into yet another marriage, this time to Tiberius, Augustus's stepson, the son of Livia. It was a disastrous match. Tiberius had no love for Julia. He resented her, resented Augustus, and resented the fact that his own desires had been trampled for dynastic necessity. He was already devoted to another woman, Vipsania, whom Augustus ordered him to divorce in order to marry Julia. The bitterness of this forced union poisoned both their lives. Their marriage was loveless, filled with cold silences and veiled hostility. Julia now had no affection at home. She was a young, vibrant woman married to a man who despised her. She had fulfilled her duty as a daughter, producing heirs for Augustus. And yet, she remained a prisoner, trapped between an ambitious father and a resentful husband. What did Julia's life look like in these years? Outwardly, she was a princess adored by Rome. She walked in processions, presided over ceremonies, and basked in the admiration of the people. She was beautiful, witty, and charming. Poets praised her elegance. Senators bowed before her. She lived in palaces, surrounded by jewels and luxury. But beneath the glitter, her life was hollow. Every decision was made for her. Every marriage was a transaction. Every child she bore was not hers, but Augustus's, pawns in his dream of a dynasty. She had no freedom, no love, no control. And so, like a bird trapped in a golden cage, Julia began to test the bars. It is in this period, her 30s during her marriage to Tiberius, that the first whispers of scandal began to circulate. Julia, always admired for her wit, began to attract admirers. Noblemen sought her company. Senators lingered in her presence. And Julia, perhaps tired of her role as pawn, began to indulge. Discreetly at first, then more boldly. Later writers claimed that Julia mocked her father as laws by indulging in affairs beneath the very monuments he built to celebrate chastity, that she turned the forum itself into her playground, that she took lovers by the dozen, choosing them not just for desire, but for the thrill of defiance. Whether these accounts are truth or exaggeration, the seed of her scandal was planted here, in the gilded cage of Augustus's household, where a princess longed for freedom. As Julia tested the boundaries of her cage, Augustus tightened the locks of Rome itself. His adultery laws were no mere political gesture. They were enforced with severity, reshaping Roman society at its core. Men of high rank were prosecuted, women of noble birth were disgraced, and the exile of Ovid served as a chilling reminder of what happened to those who mocked the emperor, his vision of morality. By day, Rome paraded as a city of virtue. Augustus's monuments rose higher, marble reminders of discipline and purity. Statues of the gods watched solemnly over citizens urged to embrace modesty and piety. But by night, in whispered circles, Julia's name spread like wildfire. The emperor's daughter was living proof that even in the house of Augustus, sin flourished. Her defiance was not quiet. Julia was said to flaunt her behavior, arriving at banquets in transparent dresses, her laughter echoing through the halls as senators and generals bent toward her. Her wit was sharp, her beauty intoxicating, and her rebellion irresistible to men accustomed to power but unaccustomed to a woman who dared to toy with it. They gathered around her not only for pleasure, but for prestige, for to be counted among Julia's lovers was itself a dangerous badge of honor. The hypocrisy grew impossible to ignore. The same emperor who exiled husbands for adultery now faced the reality that his own daughter had turned the heart of Rome into her playground. Rumors multiplied. Julia's meetings with her lovers were said to take place on the very steps of the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum, under the gaze of the monuments Augustus had built to celebrate his dynasty. Whether exaggerated or not, the scandal was too visible to conceal. Augustus's laws had been meant to bind Rome together with discipline. Instead, they exposed him to ridicule. Senators whispered behind closed doors. How could the emperor control the empire if he could not control his daughter? Common citizens laughed in taverns that Augustus had punished them for sins his own family committed with abandon. The emperor who built Rome's moral foundations now stood humiliated by the very person meant to embody them. For Julia, rebellion became identity. She had been denied love, denied freedom, denied control over her own life. But in scandal, she found power. She could humiliate her father without raising an army, undermine his reforms without lifting a sword. She became, in her own way, a political actor, one who wielded her body as a weapon against the suffocating system that had caged her. And yet, even as she reveled in her defiance, the danger grew. Rome was watching. Enemies of Augustus sharpened their knives, ready to use Julia's scandal against him. Loyalists whispered that she must be silenced before she destroyed not only her own reputation, but the fragile image of the new empire itself. The whispers became roars. Julia's affairs were no longer the private gossip of the elite, but the talk of Rome itself. Senators chuckled behind their hands, merchants repeated stories in the markets, and even slaves carried the tales through the streets. Rome's greatest irony had become common entertainment. The emperor who had criminalized adultery now had a daughter who flaunted it openly. The most infamous rumor told that Julia did not hide her liaisons in secret chambers or private villas. Instead, she chose the forum, the sacred heart of Roman political life, as her stage. Beneath the rostra, where laws were proclaimed, and where Augustus himself had spoken of discipline and purity, Julia was said to meet her lovers in the shadows of the night. The steps of Rome's monuments became, in the stories of her detractors, the couches of her passion. Whether exaggerated or not, the symbolism was devastating. Julia's rebellion was no longer just personal, it was political theater. To break her father's laws was one thing. To do it under the gaze of his monuments was to mock him before the entire empire. Her circle of lovers was said to include men of noble birth, senators, equestrians, even married men who risked disgrace for the thrill of her company. Some came for pleasure, others for ambition, believing that closeness to Julia might one day translate into power. For Julia, these encounters were not merely indulgence but a form of revenge. Denied freedom by her father, despised by her husband, she seized the one form of agency available to her: her body, her wit, and her ability to humiliate the emperor by her defiance. Banquets became arenas of scandal. Julia would appear adorned in daring clothing, drinking freely, laughing louder than decorum allowed. She charmed poets, dazzled generals, and disarmed senators. To some she was intoxicating, a living rejection of the suffocating morality Augustus had tried to impose on Rome. To others she was a monster, a threat to the stability of the empire. But scandal is never without consequence. The walls of the palace were not thick enough to keep the stories from Augustus's ears. Each tale, each whisper, each accusation chipped away at the image he had so carefully crafted for decades. Augustus, the guardian of virtue, the lawgiver of morality, was being mocked in every street corner of his empire, and the laughter was directed not at Julia, but at him. The situation grew untenable. Julia's scandal had crossed the line from family shame to political danger. The empire could endure many things, but it could not endure the emperor's daughter turning the forum itself into a brothel. Augustus had to act, and Rome held its breath to see how the father of laws would punish the child who had broken them all. Augustus did not strike quickly. For years he had endured Julia's whispers, perhaps out of love for his daughter, perhaps out of fear of public backlash. But as the scandals grew louder, he could no longer ignore them. The emperor, who had built his power on the promise of moral purity, now faced the ultimate test. Could he punish his own blood with the same severity he had inflicted on others? The breaking point came when Julia's network of lovers was finally exposed. Whether through betrayal, political maneuvering, or Augustus's spies, the names of her companions reached the emperor's ears. Senators, knights, men of high status were implicated. It was no longer a matter of rumor. It was a conspiracy of humiliation wrapped around the imperial household. Augustus was devastated. Ancient accounts say he wept as he read the accusations, torn between a father's love and an emperor's duty. But the choice was clear. To protect his laws, to protect his image, Julia had to be sacrificed. One by one, her lovers were rounded up. Some were tried and condemned. Others took their own lives before judgment could be passed. A few, perhaps shielded by influence, escaped with exile. The purge of Julia's circle was swift and brutal, a warning to Rome that the emperor's laws still held teeth. And Julia herself? She was dragged from the luxury of her palaces and cast into exile. No trial was held, for her guilt was considered self-evident. Augustus chose the island of Pandateria, a barren, windswept rock off the coast of Italy, as her prison. The woman once adorned in jewels, once surrounded by senators and poets, was now left to wither in isolation, far from the marble heart of Rome. The image of Julia's downfall spread across the empire. To some it was justice, proof that not even the emperor's family could escape the law. To others it was tragedy, the silencing of a woman who had dared to defy the suffocating grip of Rome as first emperor. For Augustus, it was agony. He had preserved his laws, but at the cost of his daughter. The man who styled himself as the father of Rome had destroyed his own child to maintain his vision of order. Pandateria was no paradise. The island was small, bleak and windswept, battered by waves and storms. For generations, it had served as a place of punishment for disgraced women of Rome's nobility. To be sent there was not only a sentence of exile, it was a sentence of oblivion. No crowds, no admirers, no lovers, only the endless sea and the cold stone of confinement. Here Julia, once the jewel of Rome, lived out her days in silence. She was stripped of her luxuries, denied the comforts of her former life. Food and clothing were rationed, her attendants few, her visitors tightly controlled. Where once she had walked in gilded halls, now she paced the barren cliffs. Where once her laughter filled banquets, now the only sound was the crash of waves. Augustus, though he had condemned her, did not forget her entirely. He allowed her a small household, permitted basic dignity, but nothing more. She was a living ghost, her existence a reminder of his greatest failure. Every decree he signed, every speech he gave about morality, was haunted by the knowledge that his own daughter had destroyed the very image he tried to build. For Julia, the silence was a torment. She who had once held the attention of Rome was now erased from its memory. Her children were taken from her, raised not as hers but as the emperor's heirs. Her lovers were gone, some dead, others disgraced. The city that had once whispered her name with scandal now whispered it with pity, or not at all. Years passed. Augustus grew older, his empire more secure, but the wound of Julia's disgrace never healed. When he died in AD 14, his will was read to the Senate. He had arranged honors, rewards, and instructions for the empire he had built. But for Julia, there was only silence. She remained in exile, forgotten while her stepson Tiberius took the throne. Julia would never return to Rome. Isolated and broken, she died far from the city of her birth. Her once glorious name now little more than a warning whispered to the next generation of Roman women. The princess who had mocked her father's laws, who had turned the forum into her playground, ended her life in loneliness, stripped of power, stripped of dignity, stripped even of memory. And yet, her story endured, for in her scandal Rome revealed its truth, that no law, no emperor, no monument could cage the desires of the human heart. Julia's rebellion, however tragic its end, lived on as a symbol of defiance against hypocrisy. She became the cruel joke of history, but also its haunting reminder that even in the house of Augustus, sin could not be erased. The scandal of Julia did not end with her death. It lingered like a shadow over the empire, a story whispered for generations. Every emperor who tried to impose morality would be measured against the failure of Augustus. Every daughter of the imperial household would live in the fear of comparison with Julia, and every citizen of Rome knew the bitter truth. Even the emperor could not master his own family. For Augustus, the hypocrisy was inescapable. He had crafted an empire of laws, but could not control the blood of his own household. He had exiled poets for indecency, yet his daughter outdid their verses with her actions. He had demanded chastity from Roman women, yet his own daughter turned chastity into mockery. In Julia's rebellion lay the great irony of Rome itself. The empire of discipline was built on foundations of indulgence. Later emperors would face their own scandals, Tiberius with his retreat to Capri, Caligula with his incestuous excesses, Nero with his marriage to a castrated boy, Elagabalus with his wild debaucheries. But Julia came first. She was the original imperial scandal, the one who exposed that the moral codes of Rome were not divine commandments, but fragile performances. Her name, blackened by Augustus's decree, nevertheless fascinated the people. To some she was a monster who spat on tradition. To others she was a victim, forced into loveless marriages, denied her own happiness, and punished not for her desires, but for daring to live them in defiance of power. History preserved both images, Julia the scandalous, Julia the tragic, Julia the princess who mocked the empire that caged her. And so, centuries later, we remember her not as Augustus wanted, a model of Roman virtue, but as the woman who destroyed his illusion of control. In her laughter, in her rebellion, in her downfall, Julia revealed the truth of Rome, that behind the marble and the laws it was still a city of flesh, of hunger, of desire. The daughter of the lawmaker broke every law he made, and in doing so she left behind a legacy that Rome could never erase. If you enjoyed this story of Rome's hidden scandals, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more untold tales of the Roman Empire.